On the 4th of December 2000, 25th year, when Russian television aired a special documentary about legendary Soviet actors, viewers suddenly saw something that had been hidden for decades. Letters from the personal archive of Lyudmila Zorina, widow of Oleg Yankovsky, which revealed the truth about their 47-year marriage. What was written in those letters forced everyone to reconsider everything they had known about this seemingly perfect couple, because it turned out that behind the image of an ideal marriage lay a completely different story. A story of sacrifice, silence, profound love, and pain that would have destroyed any other family, but somehow made this one stronger. Oleg Yankovsky, the most elegant and intellectual actor of Soviet cinema, the man whose face graced the covers of magazines and whose name was known in every corner of the Soviet Union, had been married to one woman from 1962 until his death in 2009. In the world of cinema and theater, where romances flare up and fade with the speed of theatrical seasons, where families often cannot withstand the test of fame and constant temptations, where divorce is almost considered the norm, such longevity seemed simply impossible, almost miraculous. Everyone spoke of them as the ideal couple, as a shining example of true love and unshakable fidelity in a profession where fidelity is rare. Journalists wrote articles about them. Young couples looked up to them. Colleagues envied their harmony, but few people knew what actually happened behind the closed doors of their home. What conversations took place late at night? What tears were shed in solitude? Few people knew about the rumors that walked through the corridors of theaters and film studios, about whispers behind their backs, about stories that the press tried to publish but were stopped by higher authorities who wanted to preserve the image of the perfect Soviet family. Few people knew what price Lyudmila paid for this marriage, how many times she had to swallow her pride, how many nights she spent alone waiting for her husband to return from filming or from meetings that lasted suspiciously long. And now, when archival documents have been opened, when witnesses have begun to speak openly without fear, when enough time has passed to tell the truth, the whole complicated, painful, but ultimately inspiring story has surfaced. Lyudmila Alexandrovna Zorina was born on the 1st of May, 1941, just 3 weeks before the Great Patriotic War began and turned the entire country into a battlefield. She grew up in those difficult times when the whole country was recovering from the terrible war, when people were rebuilding cities from ruins brick by brick, when they were believing in a bright future despite all the hardships they had endured, when the spirit of victory and hope filled the air. From her earliest youth, Lyudmila dreamed of the stage with an intensity that surprised even her parents. She had a rare combination of qualities that directors search for their entire lives: striking beauty with red hair that caught every light, genuine talent that could not be taught, iron character that helped her overcome any obstacle, and incredible determination that never let her give up, no matter how difficult things became. When she entered the Saratov Theater School, a prestigious institution known throughout the Soviet Union for producing excellent actors, teachers immediately noticed this bright, talented girl who stood out even among other gifted students. She was not just beautiful in the conventional sense. She possessed something more important for an actress. She could transform on stage completely. She could make the audience believe in any role, no matter how difficult. She could inhabit any character so fully that people forgot they were watching a performance. After graduation, Lyudmila began working at the Saratov Drama Theater, and very quickly, within just a year or two, she became one of the leading actresses of the theater, the one whose name drew crowds. Her name appeared on posters in large letters. People came specifically to see her performances and were never disappointed. Critics wrote laudatory reviews praising her technique and emotional depth. Directors fought for the opportunity to work with her. She had everything ahead of her: fame that would spread beyond Saratov, brilliant roles in major Moscow theaters, perhaps even a career in cinema, which was just beginning to flourish in the Soviet Union. She was independent, strong, confident in herself and her abilities, a modern woman who knew what she wanted from life. Her friends and colleagues said that Lyudmila had a difficult character, that she was demanding and uncompromising, that she always knew exactly what she wanted and always achieved her goals no matter what obstacles stood in her way. Nobody could have predicted that this strong, successful woman would soon make a choice that would change her entire life. Oleg Ivanovich Yankovsky was born on the 23rd of February, 1944 year in the city of Zhezkazgan in Kazakhstan, where his family had been evacuated during the war to escape the Nazi invasion. His childhood was not easy and was marked by tragedy that would shape his entire worldview. His father, Ivan Pavlovich Yankovsky, was arrested during Stalin's purges and died in a prison camp under circumstances that were never fully explained to the family. Oleg's mother, Marina Ivanovna, raised her children alone in incredibly difficult conditions, working multiple jobs to feed them, and she did it with dignity and strength that her sons would remember their entire lives. The boy remembered how in their home they spoke about his father only in a whisper, how his mother explained in veiled, careful terms where his father was, how the shadow of fear hung over their family, like all families touched by Stalin's terror. But even in those difficult years, filled with poverty and uncertainty, the boy dreamed of theater with a passion that helped him survive. He wanted to become an actor, to play on stage, to transform into different people and live different lives, to escape the harshness of reality through art. After finishing school with excellent marks, he entered the Saratov Theater School, following his dream despite his mother's worries about the instability of an actor's life. And fate brought him to the same city where Lyudmila Zorina was already shining on stage like an established star. They met in the theater school in the mid-1960s when Lyudmila was already studying in her third year and Oleg was just a second-year student, younger and less experienced. Their first encounter happened when they were both assigned to organize a holiday concert for the school, and they were given one dressing room to share for preparations. In that small dressing room, surrounded by costumes and makeup, they began talking and discovered they had so much in common: their love for theater, their understanding of art, their views on life. Their acquaintance was not love at first sight in the romantic sense, not the kind of instant passion that movies portray. It was something deeper and more lasting, mutual recognition of kindred spirits, the feeling that they had known each other forever, that they understood each other without words. Lyudmila saw in this young man with an unusual, intelligent face, with deep, thoughtful eyes that seemed to see more than others, something that other people did not notice or appreciate. She saw raw talent that needed to be nurtured and developed. She saw the future star before anyone else could imagine it. She saw in him a depth of soul and intensity of feeling that she recognized as the mark of a truly great actor. Colleagues at the theater school later joked that Oleg was the only man in the entire city of Saratov capable of enduring Lyudmila's famously difficult character, her high demands, her uncompromising standards. And she was the only woman who managed to see the future legendary actor in a beginning student who was receiving only small, insignificant roles. Before long, Oleg took Lyudmila to meet his mother, Marina Ivanovna, which in those times was a serious step that signified serious intentions. The mother, who had suffered so much in her life, looked at this confident, talented girl and gave her blessing. She told them both something that would become the foundation of their marriage, words that Oleg would remember his entire life. Yankovsky men marry once and for life. Marriage is not a draft that you can rewrite. Marriage is sacred and forever. This statement, spoken with the authority of a woman who had endured terrible losses, became an absolute truth for Oleg, a principle that he would try to follow despite all temptations and difficulties. They married in 1962, and from that moment, Lyudmila's life changed dramatically and irreversibly. She made a decision that shocked many of her colleagues and admirers. She went to the director of the Saratov Theater and had a difficult, emotional conversation that people still talk about decades later. "You do not see what talent is being wasted," she told him insistently, passionately, using all her persuasive powers. "Give him the main role, just one chance, and you will see a real miracle on stage. You will see an actor who will make this theater famous throughout the entire Soviet Union." The director, who respected Zorina tremendously and valued her as one of his best actresses, nevertheless doubted the young actor's readiness for serious dramatic roles. He thought Oleg needed more time, more experience, more training. But Lyudmila was persistent and would not take no for an answer. She believed in her husband so completely that she was willing to stake her own career on his success. Lyudmila even set an ultimatum, something unheard of in the Soviet theatrical hierarchy, where actors were expected to obey directors without question. "Give him the main role, or I am leaving this theater forever." This was not an empty threat or a manipulation tactic. She meant every word, and the director knew it. And she kept her word, demonstrating the iron will and determination that defined her character. When the director finally agreed and gave Oleg a leading role, the young actor proved Lyudmila right beyond anyone's expectations. He was brilliant, he was transformative, he inhabited the character so completely that the audience sat in stunned silence and then erupted in thunderous applause. Within months, the whole city of Saratov started coming to performances specifically to see Yankovsky, and his reputation began to spread. Parallel to championing her husband's career, Lyudmila began to gradually, deliberately recede into the background of theatrical life. She began to appear on stage less and less often, choosing only roles that did not require long, exhausting rehearsals or extensive time away from home. All her time, all her energy, all her considerable talent for organization and insight she directed towards supporting her husband in every possible way. She helped him work on roles late into the night, discussed the finest nuances of characters over breakfast, suggested the right intonations and gestures, gave him the honest feedback that only someone who truly understood acting could provide. This was a conscious, deliberate choice made by a woman who saw in her husband's talent something greater than just acting gift, something that transcended her own ambitions. She saw a genius that needed to be protected and nurtured. She saw an artist who could bring something important to the world, and she decided that helping him achieve his potential was more important than her own career, no matter how successful it might have been. Friends and colleagues tried to talk her out of it. "You are throwing away your own talent," they told her. "You could be famous throughout the Soviet Union. Why are you sacrificing everything for him?" But Lyudmila only smiled and said, "You will see. One day you will understand." In 1968, a new chapter began in their life when their son Philippe was born. Lyudmila, who had always been distinguished by determination and dedication in everything she did, approached motherhood with the same selflessness and intensity with which she once conquered the theatrical stage and won the hearts of audiences. "When I first took little Philippe in my arms and looked into his eyes, I understood that now I have a real family, a real home, a real purpose beyond just acting," Oleg recalled many years later in one of his rare personal interviews. Lyudmila created not just a home in the physical sense, she created a special atmosphere, a sanctuary where her husband could work and create without worry, where he could restore his strength after exhausting rehearsals and filming, where he could find inspiration and peace. She understood intuitively, perhaps because she was an artist herself, how important it is for a creative person to have a reliable rear. A safe place where you can be vulnerable and authentic, where you do not have to perform or maintain an image. In our house, it always smelled of freshly baked pies and bread, their son Philippe told journalists when he grew up and became an actor himself. Mama knew how to create a real holiday out of an ordinary day, how to make everyone feel loved and special. But Lyudmila was not just a housewife cooking meals and cleaning rooms. She created a special intellectual and spiritual environment in which the talents of both her husband and her growing son could develop naturally and fully. There were always books in their home, always music playing, always interesting conversations at the dinner table about art and life and meaning. Philippe grew up in an atmosphere saturated with creativity and unconditional love, watching his mother's quiet strength and his father's artistic passion. Lyudmila never pressured her son, never imposed her own ideas about what his future should be, but always supported his interests and aspirations, whatever they might be, giving him the freedom to discover his own path. Meanwhile, Oleg Yankovsky's career began to take off in ways that exceeded even Lyudmila's confident predictions. The famous director Mark Zakharov saw him performing in Saratov and immediately invited him to Moscow to join the Lenkom Theater, one of the most prestigious theaters in the entire Soviet Union. This was the break every provincial actor dreamed of, the opportunity that could change everything. The family moved to Moscow, leaving behind Saratov, where they had built their life together, and Oleg began receiving roles in major films. He worked with great directors who recognized his unique talent. In 1979, he played the main role in the film That Very Munchausen, a philosophical comedy that became a cultural phenomenon. And this role made him truly famous throughout the entire Soviet Union and beyond. The whole country spoke about him with admiration and affection. Women wrote him love letters by the thousands. Men respected him and wanted to be like him. Directors quoted his lines. Children recognized him on the street. He became not just a star, but a cultural icon, a symbol of intelligence and elegance in Soviet cinema. But with fame and recognition came something else, something darker and more complicated. Constant attention from other women who were drawn to his fame and charisma. Temptations that appeared at every film festival and theater premiere. Opportunities that had not existed before when he was just a struggling actor in Saratov. Beautiful actresses threw themselves at him. Young admirers waited at stage doors. Women in restaurants sent him notes with their phone numbers. The world opened up to him in ways that tested his character and his marriage vows. And then, one day, during filming in the early 1980s, there was a meeting that changed everything and set a pattern that would repeat throughout the years. The film crew was working on a project in a location far from Moscow, and the atmosphere on set, as always happens during long filming sessions, was filled with creative energy, long hours of intense work, late-night conversations, and that special closeness that arises between actors during filming when they live together isolated from normal life. A talented young actress was working in the same film, and on set, as often happens in the hothouse atmosphere of filmmaking, something sparked between her and Oleg. At first, these were just innocent conversations between takes about art and life. Then the conversations became longer and more personal, extending into dinners and walks. Then something more developed, crossing the line from friendship into something that had to be hidden. Witnesses from the film crew later recalled that their connection was obvious to everyone on set, despite their attempts to be discreet. They tried to hide their involvement, meeting in secret places and avoiding being seen together publicly. But in the world of cinema, where everyone knows everyone and gossip spreads faster than wildfire, secrets do not last long. Whispers began almost immediately. First among the film crew members who noticed long glances and private jokes. Then the rumors spread to theatrical circles in Moscow, passed along in dressing rooms and theater buffets, then throughout the entire Moscow artistic community. Yankovsky has an affair. These words were repeated endlessly in conversations, each person adding their own embellishments and interpretations. Someone claimed they saw them together in a restaurant in a dark corner, holding hands. Someone else swore they had heard them talking intimately on a film set late at night. Someone spread a story about seeing them leaving a hotel together. The press tried to write about it. Journalists prepared articles with photographs and testimony, but the articles were stopped before publication. In those years of strict Soviet control, scandals involving famous actors were not welcomed by authorities who wanted to maintain the image of moral purity in the arts. But the most terrible thing, the thing that made this betrayal cut so deep, was different and more painful than public humiliation. Lyudmila knew everything. She was not naive or blind to what was happening. She heard the whispers that stopped when she entered a room. She saw the meaningful glances exchanged between colleagues. She read the unspoken truth in her husband's eyes when he returned home after filming, in the way he avoided her gaze, in his guilty silence. Friends who were close to her during this period later said that she suffered terribly, but held on with incredible strength, maintaining her dignity in public while falling apart in private. She did not make scenes or throw dishes or scream accusations, as many women would have done, and as she had every right to do. She did not confront the other woman or demand that Oleg choose between them. She was silent, swallowing her pain and humiliation. And this silence was worse than any scream, more devastating than any confrontation, because it came from a depth of hurt that had no words. But this was not the only case, not an isolated mistake that could be forgiven and forgotten. Over the years, there were several such stories, a pattern that repeated itself with painful regularity. Each time it followed almost the same pattern, like a script that Oleg could not escape. Filming in a distant location, enforced closeness on set with attractive co-stars, rumors that spread through Moscow, whispers and knowing looks. In the mid-1980s, during work on another film that took him away from home for months, Oleg met a young actress who was only 17 years old, barely more than a girl. She was stunningly beautiful in the fresh way of youth, talented in a raw, undeveloped way, and completely starstruck by the famous actor who was kind to her. Their affair began right there during filming, and according to witnesses, Oleg did not particularly try to hide it this time, perhaps because he was far from Moscow and thought the news would not reach his wife. The girl was young, impressionable, beautiful, full of admiration and worship for the famous actor who paid attention to her. For her, he was an idol, a legend, a man who could teach her everything about acting and life, a father figure and lover combined in a confusing mix. For him, she was youth incarnate, admiration that fed his ego, an escape from the routine of domestic life and the weight of responsibilities. They spent time together between takes. He gave her acting lessons in his trailer. They talked for hours about theater and cinema and art. And then the conversations turned to more personal things. The actress herself later admitted in an interview, "The entire creative team quietly laughed behind my back, making jokes and bets. I wonder how this will end. Will the girl be able to resist Yankovsky's charm?" And honestly, it was impossible to resist Oleg Yankovsky's charm when he turned it on you fully. And again, rumors spread through Moscow like wildfire, carried by crew members who returned to the capital. Again, theatrical circles whispered in scandalized tones, though many were not surprised because this was becoming a pattern. Again, Lyudmila knew everything and was silent, absorbing the pain like she had learned to do. Her friends, who watched her suffer, could not understand her choices and begged her to take action. "Why do you tolerate this humiliation?" they asked her with genuine confusion and concern, gathering around her in her kitchen over tea. "Why do not you leave him and start fresh? Why do not you demand that he choose between you and his affairs? You deserve better than this. You are beautiful, talented. You sacrificed everything for him, and this is how he repays your devotion?" But Lyudmila only shook her head slowly, with a sad smile that held more wisdom than her friends could understand. "You do not understand," she said quietly but firmly. "This is my choice, made with open eyes and full knowledge. This is my life, and I choose to live it this way. This is my love, and real love is not a fairy tale." Then there was another story with another actress, and another one after that, each leaving its mark on Lyudmila's heart. Each time the pattern repeated with minor variations. Each time Oleg eventually returned home, sometimes after weeks, sometimes after months, carrying guilt in his eyes and silence on his lips. Each time Lyudmila accepted him back, without demands or ultimatums, without making him beg or grovel, simply opening the door and letting him return to the life they had built together. Each time she did not ask questions about where he had been or what he had done, granting him the dignity of silence. Years later, long after Oleg's death, one of the actresses who had worked with him during those turbulent years said in a brutally honest interview that shed light on his internal struggle, "Yankovsky was a man who did not know who he wanted to be or what he was searching for. He once told me in a moment of vulnerability, 'I am afraid to leave this life without understanding who I really am.'" And Lyudmila remained silent through all his searching because somewhere deep down she knew. In a sense, he had already left. He was already gone, chasing something he could never catch. But with each case, with each affair that began and ended, it became more and more obvious to those watching. This was not just a series of casual, meaningless affairs driven by simple lust or ego. This was something deeper and more complex, something that required understanding rather than just judgment. The internal struggle of a man torn between family duty and personal freedom, between his love for his wife and children and his need for something else he could not name. Lyudmila tried desperately to understand what drove her husband to betray her again and again. She tried to find answers to questions that tormented her in the long nights when she lay awake alone in their bed, questions that circled endlessly in her mind. Why does he do this if he loves me as he claims? Does he not truly love me after all these years together? Does he not value the family we have built, the life we share? Does he not see how I suffer each time, how a part of me dies with each betrayal? She talked with friends who had experienced similar situations in their own marriages, seeking wisdom and perspective. Some advised her to leave without looking back, to cut her losses and start fresh while she still could. "You are a talented, beautiful woman," they said with conviction. "You sacrificed your entire career for him, gave up fame and success that should have been yours, and this is how he repays your devotion and sacrifice? Leave him. Take your son and start a new life. You deserve happiness." Others advised her to fight fire with fire, to use power plays and ultimatums. Demand that he stop this behavior immediately. Give him an ultimatum he cannot ignore. Make him choose between you and his affairs. Force his hand. Show him you have pride and limits. But Lyudmila, after much soul-searching and reflection, chose neither of these conventional paths that most women would have taken. She chose a third path, one that required perhaps even more courage, the path of conscious silence and radical acceptance. This was not weakness or passivity as some thought. This was not the behavior of a doormat without self-respect. This was her conscious, deliberate choice, based on a deep understanding of who her husband was and what their marriage meant. She understood that Oleg was not just a husband who came home from an office job every evening. He was a talented, brilliant actor, a creative person who lived by special laws that ordinary people did not understand, whose soul operated on a different frequency. She understood that his affairs were not fundamentally about not loving her or finding her inadequate. They were about his eternal search for himself, his existential fear of being ordinary or conventional, his desperate need to prove to himself that he was still young and vital and capable of conquering new territories. But the most important understanding Lyudmila reached through her pain was this. She knew in her bones that if she gave him a hard ultimatum, if she demanded that he choose between her and his freedom, she would lose him forever. Not because he would necessarily leave her for another woman, though that was possible, but because she would destroy something fragile and essential that connected them on a deeper level. The foundation of trust and understanding, the ability to be themselves next to each other without pretense, the space for honesty even when honesty was painful. Therefore, she was silent, not out of weakness, but out of strategic wisdom. She suffered terribly, her heart breaking with each new betrayal. But she was silent. She cried alone in the bathroom and in the garden where no one could see. But she was silent in public. She waited patiently through each of his passions, knowing from experience that they would burn out eventually, that the flames of infatuation always died and he would return home again seeking the comfort only she could provide. And just when it seemed to everyone watching that this painful pattern would continue forever, that they would live this way until death, something happened that revealed everything and brought the situation to a crisis point. In the late 1990s, when they had been married for more than 35 years, information appeared that shook Lyudmila to her core and brought her patience to its absolute limit. Rumors began circulating, and then evidence emerged that Oleg had an illegitimate son from one of his previous relationships, a child he had never acknowledged publicly. This was not just another affair that would fade with time like all the others. This was not just a momentary lapse of judgment or a brief escape from reality. This was a child, a living human being who carried Oleg's blood and genes, a person who would grow up without a father. And Oleg had never even mentioned his existence to his wife. The news came unexpectedly to Lyudmila, delivered by a well-meaning friend who thought she should know, and it hit her like a physical blow that knocked the breath from her lungs. Not a scandal played out in public, Not a dramatic confrontation with tears and screaming, just a blow to the heart, silent and devastating. When she confronted Oleg with this information, he said nothing in his defense, did not justify himself, or make excuses or deny the truth, simply disappeared from their home for several days without explanation. When Oleg finally returned after those days of absence, looking exhausted and haunted, he and Lyudmila had a conversation that no one else heard, a conversation that lasted through the night behind closed doors, but which fundamentally changed everything between them. What exactly they said to each other, what accusations were made and what confessions offered, what promises were given and what forgiveness was granted, remained forever between them, a secret they took to their graves. But after this conversation, after that night of brutal honesty and raw emotion, something shifted profoundly in their relationship in a way that everyone close to them could sense. Lyudmila realized that silence has its limits, that even her capacity for acceptance was not infinite, that acceptance and understanding do not mean she has no right to express her own pain and anger, that love, no matter how deep, does not mean she must endure absolutely everything without protest or boundaries. And Oleg realized, perhaps for the first time truly understood, that he could lose what he valued most in all the world: his family, his home, his faithful rear guard, the woman who had believed in him when no one else did. He understood that Lyudmila's patience, which had seemed infinite, actually had limits that he had nearly crossed, that her love, unconditional as it seemed, could be destroyed if pushed too far, that he was standing at the edge of an abyss and needed to step back before it was too late. From that moment forward, their relationship entered a completely new phase, a different kind of marriage. This was no longer just Lyudmila's one-sided sacrifice, where she gave everything and he took freely. This was a mutual choice, made by both of them with full awareness, to be together despite everything that had happened, to preserve the family despite all the trials and betrayals, to build something new on the foundation of what they had nearly destroyed. Colleagues and friends who saw them together in those later years said that something had fundamentally changed between them in a way that was visible to the outside world. There was less romantic passion, but infinitely more depth and understanding. Less superficial romance and flowers and grand gestures, but more genuine intimacy and connection. Less performance of the perfect couple, but more authentic partnership. They became closer than they had ever been, even closer than in their early years of passionate young love, because now their closeness was built on full knowledge of each other's darkest sides and conscious choice rather than illusion. They learned to talk honestly about things that had previously been buried in silence, to name the unnameable, to speak truth even when truth was uncomfortable. They learned the difficult arts of asking for forgiveness and granting it, of acknowledging harm done and accepting responsibility, of rebuilding trust one day at a time. Oleg began to spend significantly more time at home with his family rather than seeking escape in work or other relationships. He spent more time with his son Philippe, trying to build the relationship they should have had all along, having real conversations instead of distant formalities. He spent time with his grandson Ivan, who had been born, discovering the joy of being a grandfather, playing with the child and telling him stories. He seemed to realize, with the clarity that sometimes comes with age, that time was running out faster than he had imagined, that the sand in the hourglass was falling grain by grain. He understood that he needed to use the time remaining to say important things that had been left unsaid, to repair relationships that had been damaged, to be fully present with the people who really mattered before it was too late. And you know what the most interesting part is? This transformation in their relationship, this evolution from crisis to deeper understanding, explains what is happening right now in our own time, why their story resonates so powerfully with people today. What exactly changed in the practical, day-to-day reality of their relationship after that crucial turning point when they chose to rebuild rather than destroy? First, and most noticeably, Oleg began to speak openly and publicly about his wife in interviews, praising her contributions and acknowledging her sacrifices, which he had rarely done before when he took her support for granted. She taught me everything important about acting, how to hear a partner on stage, how to feel the space around you, how to find precise intonations that make a character live, he admitted in one interview. These words were not just polite gratitude or empty praise expected from a husband. They were genuine recognition of her crucial role in his life and career. acknowledgement that his success was built on her foundation. Second, Lyudmila stopped completely hiding her pain and pretending everything was perfect, though she remained dignified and did not air grievances publicly. She remained silent about the details of their struggles in public interviews and maintained privacy. But in the circle of close friends and family, she began to talk more openly about what she had experienced over the decades, what she had felt during the dark times, how she had survived. This was her way of healing after years of silent suffering. To speak her truth, to share the burden with trusted confidants, to let go of the weight she had carried alone for so long. Third, they consciously built a new form of relationship that was different from both the passionate romance of their youth and the painful middle years of betrayal. This was no longer the idealistic marriage that had existed in their youth when everything seemed simple and possible. This was no longer the one-sided arrangement where she sacrificed and he took without appreciation. This was a mature union of two people who had gone through fire and water together, who knew each other's worst sides and deepest flaws, and still chose consciously to be together, who valued what they had built over decades. Philippe, their son, later said in interviews after becoming a successful actor and director himself that in his father's last years, Oleg became a different person in fundamental ways. He became softer and more approachable, more open emotionally and less guarded, more present in the moment rather than always chasing the next role or conquest. He began to talk more with his son about real things rather than superficialities, to share his thoughts and fears and regrets honestly, to ask Philippe's advice and opinions and actually listen to the answers. It was as if he was hurrying to make up for all those years when he had been physically present but emotionally distant and closed off, all the time he had wasted on things that did not truly matter. And Lyudmila, for her part, found a kind of peace she had not known in decades, a settling of her soul. Not because everything suddenly became perfect, or all the pain disappeared, or the past was erased. The scars remained and always would, but because she finally accepted reality exactly as it was, rather than struggling against it. She accepted Oleg as he truly was, with all his profound weaknesses and character flaws, all his terrible mistakes and betrayals, all his endless searching and restlessness that had caused her so much pain. She understood and made peace with the fact that this was the price of loving a genius, that extraordinary talent often comes with extraordinary flaws. That talented, creative people often cannot live by the ordinary rules that govern normal marriages, that they need more freedom and space and opportunities for self-expression than conventional relationships allow. But she also clearly set boundaries that had not existed before, boundaries that protected her dignity and selfhood. She made it unmistakably clear to Oleg that there were certain things she would absolutely not tolerate going forward, that there were lines that could not be crossed again without destroying everything, that love is not slavery or self-erasure, that she had the right to her own dignity and self-respect even within their unusual arrangement. And Oleg, to his credit, accepted these boundaries and limitations without resentment. He understood that he had been given an incredible second chance that most men would not receive, that few marriages survive what theirs had endured. He understood that not every woman in the world would have had the strength or wisdom to endure what Lyudmila had endured over decades, that her capacity for forgiveness was extraordinary and rare, that he was incredibly, unbelievably lucky to have such a woman as his wife, and he had come dangerously close to losing her forever through his own selfishness. Evidence that their marriage went through a profound crisis but ultimately survived and even grew stronger can be found in many different sources if you know where to look. First, there are testimonies from colleagues who worked with Yankovsky in different periods of his career and observed the evolution of his relationship with his wife. Directors and actors who knew them both noted how dramatically his way of speaking about Lyudmila changed over the decades. In the early years of fame, he almost never mentioned her in interviews, as if she did not exist or was irrelevant to his success. In his later years, he spoke of her constantly with deep respect and gratitude, crediting her with his achievements. Second, there are archival photographs that tell their own story if you look carefully at the body language and expressions. If you examine pictures from the 1970s and early 80s, you can see a certain physical and emotional distance between Oleg and Lyudmila even when they are standing together. They are in the same frame but somehow separate, not quite connecting. In photographs from the 2000s, particularly the last years, they stand noticeably closer. Their glances toward each other are warmer and more tender, their gestures more affectionate and natural, their connection visible and real. Third, there is the testimony of their son Philippe, who lived through all of it and saw both the worst times and the reconciliation. In multiple interviews given after his father's death, he repeatedly said that his parents' marriage was not simple or easy or anything like a fairy tale, but it was profoundly real and authentic in a way that superficially perfect marriages are not. He said they went through terrible, difficult times that could easily have destroyed them, but they made the choice to remain together and rebuild, and that choice made all the difference. He spoke of their love not as a romantic story, but as a daily choice, a commitment renewed over and over. Fourth, there is the evidence of Oleg's behavior during Lyudmila's illness and then his own final illness. When Oleg learned in 2008 that he had pancreatic cancer, one of the most aggressive and deadly forms of cancer, Lyudmila became his main support and caregiver, his rock. She practically did not leave his side during his illness, forgetting completely about her own needs and interests and health, devoting herself entirely to caring for him. Their son Philippe later described those final months to journalists. Mama was with him every single minute of every day. She took care of him like he was a small child who needed constant attention. She talked to him for hours, read to him when he was too weak to read himself, simply sat nearby holding his hand when he was in too much pain for conversation. Her devotion was absolute. Fifth, and perhaps most powerfully, there are the words of Oleg himself in his last interviews before death claimed him. Shortly before he died on the 20th of May, 2009, he gave a long, reflective interview to the newspaper Komsomolskaya Pravda, where he talked with unusual openness about his entire life, his long career, his regrets and satisfactions, his family. He spoke of his wife Lyudmila with such genuine warmth and depth of gratitude, with such obvious love and appreciation, that even the experienced journalist who conducted the interview was visibly touched and had to pause to collect herself. "She is the main person in my entire life, the one who made everything else possible," he said with complete sincerity. Without her belief in me and her support and her wisdom, I would not have become who I became. I would have been nothing. Everything I achieved, I owe to her." With each new piece of evidence examined, with each testimony considered, there were fewer and fewer doubts about the essential truth. Despite all the trials and betrayals, despite all the pain and crises that could have destroyed them, their marriage not only survived, but transformed into something deeper. And it was not just bare survival, hanging on by a thread. It was a kind of victory, hard-won and precious. A victory of love over pride, of forgiveness over justified resentment, of wisdom over reactive emotions, of commitment over convenience. What is happening with this story right now, here in early December of 2020, fifth year, so many years after Oleg's death? Interest in the fate and relationship of Oleg Yankovsky and Lyudmila Zorina is not fading with time as one might expect. On the contrary, it seems to be growing stronger, touching new generations who discover their story. In recent years, several documentary films have been released dedicated to the life and work of Yankovsky, examining his artistic legacy. In each of these documentaries, significant time and attention is devoted to his personal life, his complex relationship with his wife, because people understand now that you cannot separate the art from the life, that his performances were shaped by his experiences. In September of 2020, fourth year, the Russian television channel Kultura showed a special program where colleagues and friends of Yankovsky, many of them now elderly themselves, talked about what kind of person he really was behind the public image. Many of them spoke about his relationship with Lyudmila with a kind of awe. "She was his guardian angel," said one elderly actress with tears in her eyes. "He could allow himself to be vulnerable and weak only with her. Only in her presence. With everyone else, he had to maintain the image." Literally last week, in the final days of November 2020, fifth year, something remarkable happened that renewed public interest. Documents from the personal archive of Lyudmila Zorina were published for the first time, materials she had kept private for decades. These include letters she wrote to friends over the years during the difficult periods, but never actually sent, keeping them instead in a private drawer. In these letters, she speaks with brutal honesty and openness about her pain and suffering, her doubts about whether she was making the right choice, her enduring love despite everything. These letters stir the soul deeply because they are written with such raw sincerity, with such complete openness and vulnerability, that it is impossible to read them and remain emotionally indifferent. You have probably heard about the intense debates that unfolded in social networks and online forums after these letters were published. The discussions reveal deep divisions in how people view marriage and forgiveness. Some people condemn Oleg harshly for his infidelities and lack of appreciation. They say angrily that he did not value his wife's sacrifices, that he caused her terrible and unnecessary pain, that he did not deserve her love or her forgiveness, that he was selfish and cruel. Others defend him passionately, trying to understand rather than judge. They say that he was a genius and that geniuses cannot be judged by ordinary moral standards that apply to regular people, that Lyudmila herself made the informed choice to stay with him knowing who he was, that their relationship was more complex than simple victim and victimizer. But the most interesting and nuanced discussions are being conducted by older people, those who are over 65 years old, those who remember that era and lived through it themselves. For them, this story is especially close and meaningful because they remember that specific time in Soviet history. They remember those particular values about family and marriage. They remember how relationships were built in that era when divorce was shameful and commitment meant something different than it does now. In our time, people did not scatter and give up at the first difficulty or disappointment, writes one elderly woman on a popular forum, her comment receiving hundreds of supportive responses. They held on to the family with both hands. They endured hardships. They forgave terrible things. And you know what? They were right to do so. Marriages built on that foundation lasted. This story concerns and matters to your children and grandchildren because the fundamental questions it raises are eternal and universal. The question of what marriage really is beyond the romance and the wedding. The question of what fidelity means in the deepest sense. The question of what real love looks like when tested by time and betrayal. These questions do not have simple answers, and each generation must wrestle with them anew. Maybe in your own city or town, there are also couples like Oleg and Lyudmila who have lived together for 40 or 50 years, who have experienced terrible crises and betrayals but remained together, who chose commitment over convenience. Interestingly enough, the story of Oleg and Lyudmila is not unique in the world of famous artists, but part of a larger pattern. If you look carefully at the biographies of other great actors throughout history, you will see remarkably similar patterns repeating across cultures and eras. Take, for example, the legendary English actor Laurence Olivier and his wife Vivien Leigh, both titans of 20th century theater. Their marriage also went through absolutely terrible trials, her devastating mental illness that grew progressively worse, his multiple infidelities that wounded her deeply, but they remained together for many difficult years before finally separating. Or consider the American actor Paul Newman and his wife Joanne Woodward, who were married for an astounding 50 years until his death. Newman himself said in interviews that the secret of their incredibly long marriage was simple. We give each other freedom to be individuals, but we always return home to each other. Home is sacred. Or think about the French actor Yves Montand and his wife Simone Signoret, both major stars. He had a very public, highly public,